Hey, welcome back. In the last video, we set up a flow that receives webhook requests from GitHub and creates corresponding data in Zendesk. As we were building the flow, we manually configured a webhook in GitHub, but that's not the user experience that we want our users to have. We want to make it so that whenever a customer deploys an instance of our integration, those webhooks are created automatically. Let's look at how to do that. To create things automatically when an instance of our integration is deployed, I'm going to go ahead and create a new flow, and I'm going to call my flow something like my setup flow. I would like my flow to trigger when an instance of my integration is deployed, so I can reach for a management component's instance deploy trigger. That'll run when a customer completes setup of my integration. I'm going to go ahead and run a sample execution of this flow because I want to look at the payload that a trigger has. If I look at my trigger here and look under its webhook URLs, notice that my trigger is cognizant not only of its own webhook URL, but of the webhook URLs of its sibling flows. And these URLs will be different for each of my customers and their instances. So effectively, I need some way of telling GitHub, hey GitHub, you need to start letting me know via webhook of events that have occurred and let me know at this URL. So to get that set up, I'm going to go ahead and add a GitHub action, specifically the repos create webhook action. Now this action takes a few inputs. It's going to take info about the repo that I want to create the webhook for. We're going to address that in just a moment, so I'm just going to put some bunk data there for a moment. The callback URL, I can reference the trigger's webhook URL object and say, hey GitHub, send requests over to this sibling flow. And that's the URL that GitHub will start sending requests to. And then what events do I want GitHub to send me notifications of? Well, as we were building out our integration in the last video, we were interested in issues and issue comments. So we'll go ahead and add those as our event types. I'm going to check my trigger over here because I forget if I set up a webhook secret. We'll ignore that for the time being. So I need some way for my customers to supply their own owner and repository portions of their repository URL. To do that, that's a concept in Prismatic that we call a data source. We want our customer in the configuration experience to be able to authenticate with GitHub and then select a repository from a drop-down menu so that we can feed that information, that user-specific information, into these inputs. So within my configuration wizard, I'm going to go ahead and create a new page called GitHub config. And I'm going to create a new config variable called GitHub repo. I want this config variable to be a pick list, in other words, a drop-down menu of their repositories that they have available to them. And I want to source that data that the drop-down menu has using the GitHub list repos data source. What an end user will see then, after I go ahead and save my changes, what an end user will see then is they'll first authenticate once more with GitHub. They'll do that on the first page of their configuration wizard. And then on subsequent pages, they'll be presented with dynamically populated drop-down menus so that they can choose a GitHub repository from a drop-down menu. So here's all of my GitHub repositories, including my example Zendesk integration repository that I have over here. So I'll select that as my option for that config variable. Now I want to look at what that config variable actually yields. So I'm going to go ahead and add a log line for a moment. And I'm going to go ahead and just simply log out that GitHub repo config variable. So the GitHub repo config variable just logs out the name of the repo. Now it looks like repos in GitHub are always separated with forward slashes. So I need to split out the Taylor Reese and the example Zendesk integration by a forward slash. To do that, I can go ahead and reach for the text manipulation split string action and say that for this config variable, I just want to split on a forward slash. So if we look at our forward slash splitting action, that's going to split that repo name into the owner and the actual repo name. So I can now feed that result on into our webhook creation step. Let's reference the split strings 0th property and the split strings first property so that the owner and the repo name are being populated appropriately. So I'll go ahead and run one more test of my integration thus far. And it looks like it created a webhook. Type repository. Here's the ID of the webhook, some information about the events that should cause events to fire, some configuration information. And if I look at this repository's webhook page, I can see that that webhook was now created. And looking at my handle GitHub events flow, I can see as well that I just received a one of those ping webhook requests that we were seeing in the last video. To round out the configuration, I just set up some uh, GitHub webhook configuration in my step. I can also set up some Zendesk configuration in my flow as well, using a similar process. Additionally, when someone deletes an integration or an instance of an integration, I probably want to clean up after myself. And so I'm going to add another flow called my removal flow. I'm going to once again reach for the management trigger and an instance remove trigger instead. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and do the splitting of the string once more. I'm going to go ahead and split my GitHub repo config variable. I'm going to go ahead and add a GitHub repos delete instance webhook step. I'm going to go ahead and feed my split repository name once more, this time into this step. And what this step is going to do is it's going to look at all webhook URLs. It'll identify ones that are pointed to the current instance, and it'll go ahead and remove all of those for me. So kind of cleaning up after myself. If I refresh my page, my webhook is now gone, and then looking at my logs, I see a log saying it deleted that specific webhook. Now, you can do the same thing with Zendesk. If you open up a copy of the integration, the completed integration that we have in documentation, you can see the exact same steps carried out in Zendesk as well. So at this point, we have flows that handle Zendesk events, handle GitHub events, set up configuration and remove configuration. All we have left to do with our integration now is to clean up our configuration wizard a little bit and get it ready for our integration marketplace. And we'll cover all of that in the next video.